Hi, everybody. Dr. Dan here, and this is week 11 of Business, Technology, and American Society. And that means we have about 4 more weeks to go before the final. So I'm going to kind of give you a broad overview of what's going on. It also means that we're reading Chapter 10 in our online text. And Chapter 10 is titled Madison Avenue and American Marketing Part 2, I think. But what it's really all about is the rise of consumerism as the basis for our economy in the U.S. And it really is an important component for us to talk about when we consider the history of business technology and the economy in the U.S. So it's also relevant, I think, to us on our everyday lives because, as most of you know, we are surrounded with advertising and people trying to persuade us at every turn. So it's important to be critical thinkers when we think about advertising and messaging that makes us vote for certain people or buy certain things. So whether you're a political candidate and you're creating political ads to try to persuade, or you're an automobile manufacturer and you're trying to persuade people to buy a certain vehicle because it fits their image, or even consumer products, something like toothpaste. Some people want to buy toothpaste that whitens their teeth because they think it's going to make them a better person. Other people want toothpaste that is a cavity-fighting toothpaste, and some people brush their teeth with mud. I mean, whatever appeals to people is largely on the basis of a buy-in to advertising, or in some cases, people that want to get away from mainstream products and go with something a little bit more natural. So marketing works in all ways, and again, it's ubiquitous. It's all around us in our society. So how does that play into history? How does that play into what we've already covered? It's pretty simple, actually. When we started this class, we talked about the first European colonists to come over in the 1600s, and we started the class by reading about capitalism and how it's kind of baked in to our culture and our society, and it's truly baked into this notion of consumerism. So we talked about the establishment of capitalism early on, and then we started to think about what's going on in the United States with the ratification of the Constitution in 1787. One of the things we talked about in the Constitution was intellectual property law, and I would argue that the basis for consumerism really has a big part in this intellectual property law with the establishment of patents and trademarks. Certainly trademarks are all about brands and protecting brands. So you can make this argument that consumerism based on brands is really sort of codified in the Constitution with intellectual property law. So it's something to think about. The other thing we talked about was, after the United States forms, the agricultural economy starts to boom. So our economy was agrarian. That means based on agriculture in the early 1800s. And then we covered the growth of the industrial economy, which really formed after 1865, post-Civil War. And we talked about these different infrastructures that were in place that were a foundation for industrialization to occur. So you might remember that was the transportation network as infrastructure, communication networks as infrastructure, and then we talked about energy and electrification. So that kind of stacks everything up in order that we've talked about. Now, in the middle of all of these historical eras and events that went on, there are components of consumerism that are starting to sort of pop in and out. And so we talked about trademark law, which is important to protect brands. But the other thing we talked about in the early 1800s was something called the American system of manufacturing. And if you recall, we talked about Eli Whitney and Samuel Colt and Isaac Singer, I think, was in there. And these were all industrialists or inventors that perfected this idea of interchangeable parts, which allowed them to manufacture things in more efficiently and to manufacture everything quicker. And it really created this mass manufacturing basis, and mass manufacturing will lead to mass merchandising at some point. So even that American system of manufacturing that we talked about in the early 1800s, plays a big role in consumerism. So again, going through these phases. We have this agricultural phase, and then post-Civil War, industry starts to grow, transportation networks, communication networks start to grow, and there's really this formation of the modern economy. Now, the cool thing is that while this economy is starting to form in the later 1800s, there's also the rise of a new middle class. There was really never a middle class in an agrarian economy. It was basically, farm to survive. But as the economy modernizes and there are more businesses and more middle management out there, there's more disposable income. And disposable income is a necessary prerequisite for consumerism to happen. So it's important to understand that disposable income is something that's really important for the growth of the economy. But what it also does is if there's money out there, if there's extra income out there, it means someone is going to come along and try to get it from you. Everyone wants your dollars. And they want your dollars, and the way they do this is by trying to persuade you to buy their products. And so it's pretty easy to see how consumerism takes off. At the same time, it's important that we understand that advertising starts to really, modern advertising really starts to come alive in the late 1800s. So there's a guy named William Dill Scott. He's an applied psychologist working in the late 1800s, and he starts to determine different ways that retailers and manufacturers can craft their messaging in such a way to persuade people to buy stuff. So there's an article from 1903 in the New York Times that I posted for you on advertising. It's very short. I want you to read that. And it talks a little bit about Scott and some of his theories. And then a guy comes along, J. Walter Thompson, in the late 1800s, and he's really seen as sort of the father of modern marketing, or the father of Madison Avenue. And J. Walter Thompson sets up one of the first advertising agencies in New York City on Madison Avenue in the late 1800s. And the company is still around today, and it's amazing. They've had clients for 100 years, like Kraft Foods, for example, in some way, shape, or form has been with J. Walter Thompson for over 90 years. So it's fascinating, and there's a link to a reading, so you can read about that. But just understand that all the messages that you read, they're all crafted in such a way to persuade you to buy goods or services. I think you're aware of that, but I think it's a nice takeaway so we can be more critical consumers as we go through our day-to-day lives. So print media, we talked about communications, is an important conduit to drive this marketing and advertising. This idea of a newfound middle class with disposable income is really important, but another really important part of the consumer economy is the establishment of installment credit, and that starts to happen in the early 1900s. And if you have a credit card, or you have a car payment or a house payment, you certainly know what installment credit is. But prior to 1900, it really wasn't a thing. And there's an interesting story, and there's a link to an article you can read about it. But Henry Ford, for example, started to sell the Model T Ford in 1908, and he was not a believer in credit. And really, a Model T Ford for an average family back in the early 1900s took about 2 years' worth of salary. So Ford, not believing in credit, had a layaway program where you could pay Ford every month, and when you paid him the price of a Model T, you would get your car. So it's kind of reverse of how we do it today. You paid up front, and when you paid them everything a car cost, you got the car. Ford's competitor at the time, Alfred P. Sloan, who was the founder of General Motors, saw what was going on and saw what consumers wanted. And in 1919, he established GMAC, which is the General Motors Assurance Corporation, which was really the financial arm of GM. And what that allowed people to do was to go in and sign for a car, get the car, and make car payments just like we do today. And that really changed the playing field as far as automobile sellers and manufacturers is concerned, because when that happened, GM quickly became the largest seller of cars in the U.S., and Ford really took a hit because of it. Eventually, Ford succumbed to consumer credit, and established Ford Motor Credit in the 1920s, I think. But the whole point of the story is that installment credit was really important as a driver to sort of boost consumerism and expand the economy, because now it wasn't just about the money supply anymore, it was about the credit supply as well. So as most of you know, myself included, a lot of the things we buy on credit. It allows us to buy more stuff. It allows sellers to sell more stuff. So along with disposable income, installment credit was an important component of consumerism. So keep that in mind as you go through the readings this week. Again, I think that there are some other factors. I feel like electrification is really an important component in consumerism, because now after electrification comes on board, retail establishments, Marshall Fields, Macy's, Wanamaker's, all of these big retailers and these giant department stores that were in business in the early 1900s, with electrification, now they can stay open after dark. So there's a big consumer component to that. They can advertise with signage, and they can create these amazing displays in their windows with electric lights. And so all of these things are meant to persuade and glorify consumer products and make us buy. But again, as far as the history goes, it's super important, because we talked about the economy going through the agricultural basis and then the industrial economy after the Civil War. And this quickly shifts in the 1920s, really beginning in the Roaring '20s, before the Depression, where the consumer economy was really starting to boom. And then post-World War II, when soldiers are returning from Europe and from Asia, in the 1950s, there's this build out of the suburbs and suburbia, and that's another stepping stone into consumerism, because you have all of these new homes, all of these soldiers returning home, all of the goods that are needed to build out new homes, and the thriving automobile industry at that time, and all of the other consumerism that goes with it. So there's a lot there, but just understand consumerism starts to take over in the early 1900s. Understand that consumerism is built on the foundations of intellectual property law. It's built on the foundations of mass manufacturing. It's built on psychological persuasion and marketing. And it's also built on this idea of a rising middle class and disposable income and installment credit. So that's a good recap of what we're doing this week. When you do your assignment this week, please make sure you follow the directions. Very important. A lot of you are doing a great job on your work, but you're not following the directions, so you're missing small components of what I'm asking for in the assignment. So this week, there's like 4 questions you have to answer about an advertisement. So make sure you start on it early, because last minute it's not going to work well on this one. So that's all I have. If you have any questions, let me know. Everyone's doing a great job. Be safe this week, and I'll talk to you again soon. Take care now. Bye-bye.